As the famous communist ruler Mao Zedong once said, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." The 100 Flowers campaign was a political movement in the People's Republic of China in which the leader of the Communist Party, Mao Zedong, encouraged his citizens to openly express their opinions about his ruling, as well as their general thoughts on the communist regime, as Mao had previously silenced those who spoke out against him. I know this political movement well as I took a history class on communist regimes and their tactics for the International Baccalaureate program in high school. While I may not be as educated as a historian, the nature of this particular political movement is very interesting to me. So today I'm going to inform you about Mao Zedong's 100 Flower campaign so you can be more aware about China's history. I'll cover four main areas: who Mao Zedong was, what the 100 Flowers campaign was, why the 100 Flowers campaign failed, and why the 100 Flowers campaign is so historically important. First, I'd like to begin with who Mao Zedong was. Mao Zedong was a Chinese communist revolutionary who founded the People's Republic of China and ruled as a leader of the Chinese Communist Party from 1949 until he died in 1976. Mao was ridiculed as being a particularly cruel leader, despite the fact that he united China whilst it was suffering from imperialism and the invasion of the Japanese military. Mao had many drastic political and economic reforms, in which some were successful but many failed horrifically, such as the Great Leap Forward, in which Mao originally aimed to transform China's economy from being a farm-based economy to an industrial-based economy. Ian Johnson from the New York Review asserts that this political movement created the largest and deadliest famine in human history, in which roughly 10 to 50 million people starved to death. In total, for Mao's political and economic movements, it's estimated that roughly 70 million people of his citizens died in total. So, after hearing about these dreadful statistics, let's discuss one of his more fundamentally interesting political campaigns, which is the 100 Flowers campaign. So, the 100 Flowers campaign was a movement created by Mao in which he encouraged his citizens to come forth and openly discuss their issues and opinions with the Communist Party, as well as ways in which these issues could be fixed. Originally under the Communist Party, speaking out against the Communist Party, as well as speaking out against Mao, was usually met with a death sentence. Therefore, the purpose of this campaign was to unite China's citizens in which they could openly and safely discuss the overall achievements as well as the failures of the Chinese Communist Party without fear or rebuke or punishment. Um, so, basically, since we just learned about what the 100 Flowers campaign was, the 100 Flowers campaign only lasted for about a year. So, why did it fail? Well, the 100 Flowers campaign failed mostly because the criticism that the Chinese Communist Party received was so incredibly negative, as basically millions of people died at the hand of the party. As I mentioned earlier, the campaign only lasted for about a year and ended as thousands were publicly criticizing Mao and his party. Jonathan Spence writes in his book, The Search for Modern China, that students protested on campuses, posters were hung in cities, rallies occurred in the streets, and magazine articles were published denouncing the members of the Chinese Communist Party. So, since there was such a negative feedback about the Communist Party, why was the 100 Flowers campaign so important and what historical purpose did it serve? Well, the 100 Flowers campaign was so important because after the campaign failed, because Mao launched an anti-rightist campaign in which the communist regime sought out and punished the scholars and citizens who were encouraged to become vocal about China's communist regime during Mao's 100 Flower campaign. As David Kaiser for Time magazine writes, hundreds of thousands of citizens were rounded up and publicly criticized, condemned to re-education camps, and were often executed. This outcome of the 100 Flowers campaign is so important because it officially turned China's scholars against the Communist Party and created a severe distrust amongst its citizens. However, due to re-education, the overall long-term effects of this political movement were relatively minimized, as the Chinese Communist Party is still around today. Finally, it's still unsure as to whether or not the original purpose of the political movement was to find and condemn those who had grudges with the Communist Party, or whether it was actually created with good intentions. So, just to review, I've shared who Mao Zedong was, what his 100 Flowers campaign was, why the 100 Flowers campaign failed, and overall why the 100 Flowers campaign is historically important. So, as a further review, the 100 Flowers campaign was a political movement in which the People's Republic of China in the People's Republic of China, in which citizens were encouraged to openly express their opinions about the communist regime. So hopefully the information presented to you today will help you become more informed about China's political history. And as seen throughout this speech, China's political history is very long, complex, and interesting. It can be sad and disheartening to think about. However, it's perplexing and interesting to think about how such a leader could have come to power and gotten away with such an absurd and destructive political campaign.